So the verses I just chanted from Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 through 28, narrate the instructions for and the observance of the first Pesach, while the Israelites were shuttered in their homes during the 10th plague, as well as the beginning of the Exodus story itself. The Torah here also commands the perennial and perpetual observance of the Pesach ritual, noting as well that once people have settled in the land of Israel, when their children and descendants ask, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem, what is this? What do you mean by this rite? We are to answer the question by saying it's the Pesach sacrifice to God, Asher Pasach, who passed over the Israelite houses in Egypt while bringing the 10th plague to strike down the firstborn Egyptians. The question cited here in our verses may sound familiar because it's the same question that our rabbinic sages ultimately attached to the Rasha, to the wicked child in the Haggadah. However, while in the Haggadah this question is taken as an indication of intent by the child to exclude him or herself from what's going on, because the question is asked in the form of, what does this ritual mean, lachem, to you? In its original context here, it is completely legitimate. It's a legitimate and innocuous way of posing a very basic question, which is, what is this Pesach thing about? The Torah's assumption is that once the actual Exodus generation is gone, and the further away in time we get from the first Pesach, the less likely the case that the people's descendants, who did not experience this original shelter-in-place order or make the journey out of Egypt and to freedom, will actually remember and understand what happened. So our ancestors through the millennia, all the way down to our current generation, are instructed to tell the story of what happened back in the day and why we're supposed to keep celebrating each year and remembering the events of the original Pesach and the Exodus. So how do we go about telling this story in our day and age? How do we share this experience with our family, our friends, our children, and our grandchildren? I mean, we could just sit down at the table and default to the most basic recap of all. They tried to kill us. We won. Let's eat. You've all probably heard that before, right? We could save ourselves an hour or two or three during our Seder experience, right? If we went that route. We could, but while we might be able to focus on themes and values from the story, the simple and hurried "we made it" narrative feels quite lacking here. I was looking through some of my Pesach materials as I was getting ready for the Seder and came across this quote from Rabbi Dr. David Hartman, Zichrono Livracha, of blessed memory, who once wrote, "The Haggadah was meant to facilitate lively dialogue. Unfortunately, Seder too often becomes rote reading to zoom through, rather than a drama of creative roles. Don't let the printed word paralyze the imagination. Talk, discuss. You are free. Shape your own Seder." David Hartman seems like a prophet this year, right? Because if you listen closely, you probably notice that he used the word zoom here in the context of racing through the basic Seder order and Haggadah narrative, which seems doubly appropriate right now in the year of the Zeder, the Zoom Seder, as some have nicknamed it. Especially when we're limited to virtually gathering via Zoom or other similar technology, rather than actually sharing a meal and a dialogue together in the same house, it's all the more tempting to zoom through the contents of the Haggadah, which runs the risk of missing out on the mitzvah of telling the story in the first place. And here's the thing. On one level, the story of Pesach is the same each year. And on another level, each year is different. And this year, during the coronavirus pandemic, it feels totally different, which can lead us to a potentially obvious but nonetheless critical observation. This completely extraordinary and unprecedented time in our lives that we are going through is going to be the story of Pesach 2020. like when grandparents or great-grandparents talked about the Depression. This feels different from anything any of us have lived through. Many people are suffering in terms of their health, and there are people dying. And even among those who have stayed healthy, many are suffering tremendous financial hardship. And that's not even factoring in the disruption of our lives in general and the upending of our social order and our ability to be in physical proximity to other people. But a critical, timeless lesson of Pesach is that if you turn your sufferings into a story, then they have meanings that can endure for generations and generations and can affect what happens afterwards. So the question is, what enduring and impactful story are we going to tell about virtual Pesach 2020 and about the coronavirus pandemic we're going through? What lessons will we want to make sure we have learned and that our children and grandchildren will learn out of this moment of crisis? I'll encourage each of you listening today to think about how you might answer this question. But I'll offer one potentially important takeaway for now, which we might choose to reflect on and discuss tonight when we gather virtually once again for our second Seder. With Pesach in general, we know that Jews are celebrating around the world. And that's holding true even this year, even if we're observing the holiday in a radically different way than ever before. This makes the holiday feel like a universally shared Jewish experience. We're all in this together, no matter where we live. And so too, on a much broader level, has the coronavirus pandemic tied everyone together in our world, unlike anything else in our lifetime. Other people, even in countries we may never have heard of, or at least might have trouble finding on a map, are going through the same struggle as we are to rein in a deadly disease. Just as Pesach and Judaism is celebrated universally by Jews, so is this suffering from the pandemic universal amongst all humanity. Which leads me to one beautiful and subtle word choice in the Haggadah. Many of us may be familiar with the oft-cited line from the Haggadah, Bechol dor vador, chayav adam lirot et atzmo, ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In every generation, each person has the obligation to see him or herself as if he or she personally went forth from the land of Egypt. We have to imagine living through the experience ourselves, to make it feel personal, to be sure the lessons stick and don't feel like irrelevant and ancient historical or religious details. But in that passage I quoted you just a moment ago, note the Haggadah doesn't say something like Chayav kol echad, every individual, or Chayav kol Yehudi, or kol Yisrael, every individual Jew is obligated. Rather, the Haggadah uses the word Adam, each person. There is no word more universal or inclusive than this one word. Each of us, every human being, Jew or non-Jew, is a Ben Adam, is a descendant, a child of Adam, the first human being created in God's image. When we say then that Chol Chayav Adam, that every person, every Adam is obligated to see him or herself as if he or she went forth from Egypt, we are really saying that the story of the Exodus is also more than the story of our personal and national saga as Jews. It is essentially the story of Adam, of humanity, the story of every man and woman. And it ought to remind us that before we can be Jews, we must understand what it means to be human beings and to be tied into the world around us. It reminds us that we are human beings first, who have a responsibility to every other human being on the planet. Part of the beauty of the Pesach Seder is that by telling our own story, we become aware of our connection to other people and are reminded to develop a deep sense of empathy for all human beings and make sure that we do what we can to help those who are suffering and make the world better. So, friends, while we're stuck in our homes, like our ancestors were during the first Pesach, let's take advantage of this opportunity to remember and tell this year's story, and a part of the Haggadah's story every year of human connection. We may feel separated from each other physically, from Jews in our family, our friends in our community and around the world, and from other people of all faiths around the world, but the Seder reminds us that we're all in this experience of humanity together, looking out for each other and offering strength and support and healing and sacrifice in order to get through these trying times. May this year's coronavirus story soon be relegated to memory as people and communities heal in the weeks and months ahead. But may we also continue to tell the story and learn necessary lessons from it and from Pesach for generations and generations to come. Amen.